Jasmine Crockett quoted federal law, so the judge fined her $1,000 for contempt. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't break a single rule. What happened next flipped the entire trial, stunned the prosecutor, and left the judge speechless. What did Jasmine Crockett reveal that was so powerful it made the judge question his own authority? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom looked tired. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow. Wooden benches creaked with every shift. The air was heavy, not hot, just thick, like it carried old arguments that never ended. A fan spun slowly, useless, loud. Papers rustled. A cough echoed. It felt less like a place for justice, more like a holding pen for quiet defeat. No one expected anything interesting. Just another case. Just another day. Then the door opened. Judge Randall Forrester entered like a man built from concrete. Straight-backed, sharp-eyed, no nonsense. His robe didn't flow. It marched. An ex-Marine turned judge. He was famous for quick rulings and zero tolerance for courtroom drama. He didn't hear arguments. He shut them down. His gavel was his weapon, and he wielded it fast. Everyone in the room knew the drill. Speak fast, say little, move on. At the defense table stood Jasmine Crockett. No flash, no noise, just stillness. Gray blazer, black slacks, folder in hand. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile. But her eyes, sharp, locked on Forrester like a sniper's scope. People barely glanced at her. A young woman, small frame, defending protesters in a courtroom that didn't care for speeches. No one saw the storm waiting beneath her silence, but they would. But beneath the silence, something was already moving. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just standing still. She was preparing to strike. She stepped forward with calm precision, every movement careful, her fingers gliding across the folder like a pianist getting ready to play. Then her voice, low but clear, cut through the stale courtroom air like a blade. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about property rights. It's about 6 citizens who used their First Amendment rights on public steps and were arrested for it." Judge Forrester didn't move. Jasmine kept going, citing Holder v. Community Network, a little-known case but one that fit perfectly. That court ruled peaceful protest on publicly accessible property isn't criminal trespass unless there's a clear disruption. That didn't happen here. She paused. Let it sink in. All my clients did was sit and speak, and that's what they were punished for. A quiet stir moved through the gallery, but Jasmine stayed locked in. She wasn't rattled. She was ready. Judge Forrester leaned forward, like a man suddenly realizing this might not go as expected. "That's not a binding case," he said, his voice tight. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. "True, Your Honor, but the Constitution doesn't change with location. The message is the same. Peaceful expression, without obstruction, is protected." Her tone didn't rise, but it struck hard. This wasn't law enforcement. It was censorship. The room froze. Even the prosecutor looked uneasy now, flipping through papers that suddenly didn't help. Jasmine let the silence grow. It wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. In that moment, she wasn't just a lawyer. She was holding the mirror up to the system and daring it to look back. But not everyone in that room was ready to hear the truth. And Judge Randall Forrester, least of all, was prepared to be called out, calmly, legally, and in front of a full courtroom. His voice broke through Jasmine's next sentence like a blade snapping midair. "Ms. Crockett," he said, slow and sharp, "this court does not entertain political speeches disguised as legal arguments. You've been warned once. Do not test me again." The words weren't just a reprimand. They were a threat wrapped in formality, the kind meant to remind her who held the gavel. But Jasmine didn't react with fear. She didn't apologize. She didn't blink. She turned to the next page in her folder, like he hadn't spoken at all, and kept going. "As I was saying, in Donovan vs. Metro PD, the court made it clear, protesting on publicly accessible property without obstruction does not constitute criminal trespass." Her voice didn't rise, but it struck harder with every word. She wasn't performing. She was prosecuting. Only the one on trial wasn't sitting at the defense table. It was the system itself. Forrester's hand hit the gavel before she even finished the sentence. One hard strike, then another. The sound cracked across the room like gunfire. That's enough. I've given you room, and you've used it to grandstand. Contempt of court, 1,000. The gavel hit again. Final. Brutal. The gallery gasped, louder this time. A woman covered her mouth. The law student in the back dropped his pen. Even the court clerk froze with her hands hovering over the keyboard. Jasmine just stood there, unmoving, like marble carved from resolve. The fine wasn't about the law. It was about control, about reminding her, without saying it, that this wasn't her space, her court, or her voice that mattered. The gavel still echoed in the room when Jasmine lifted her eyes. Not with rage, not with shock, but with precision. She didn't flinch. She didn't breathe fire. Instead, she let the insult hang in the air like smoke, then stepped through it without a tremor. Her voice came low, clear, and devastating in its restraint. "Your Honor," she said, "I respectfully request that the court provide its written rationale for the contempt citation so it may be entered into the appellate record." No emotion, no sarcasm, just the law, delivered like a scalpel instead of a sword. The temperature in the room dropped a full 10 degrees. The clerk blinked. The bailiff shifted. Even Judge Forrester, whose gavel had thundered seconds ago, didn't move. Because what Jasmine had just done wasn't defiance. It was control. She didn't fight fire with fire. She suffocated it with formality, and the court didn't know what to do with that. Everything slowed. You could feel it. The scraping of a chair leg suddenly sounded too loud. The flicker of fluorescent lights above seemed to grow sharper, harsher, as if the building itself was caught off guard. A lawyer in the gallery cleared his throat but didn't speak. No one did. The prosecutor stopped flipping pages. The law student in the back leaned forward, pen frozen midair. In a room built to silence dissent, Jasmine had made her voice the loudest by barely raising it at all. And for the first time that day, the courtroom didn't feel like it belonged to Judge Forrester. It felt suspended, unsettled, like something unspoken had just cracked the surface. Jasmine didn't press. She didn't smirk. She stood in that silence like a wall that wouldn't move. And without saying it out loud, the message was already clear. You can find me, but you will explain yourself, and I'll be waiting. And while the courtroom sat frozen in silence, Jasmine's mind flashed back. 2 days earlier, before the gavel, before the fine, before the fight. Back to when the injustice first landed on her desk like a quiet spark waiting to ignite. It was late afternoon. The sun had already begun to drop behind the concrete skyline of Dallas, casting long shadows across the floor of Jasmine's office. The place wasn't fancy. No floor-to-ceiling windows, no chrome finishes, just stacks of case files, a flickering desk lamp, and walls that knew the weight of real battles. Her phone buzzed once, then again. She answered with a clipped, "Crockett." The voice on the other end belonged to Elise, a volunteer paralegal from a local civil rights group. "You heard about the Northern Star arrests?" Jasmine hadn't. 6 people taken in this morning. Protest on the front steps. No damage, no shouting. Just sitting and reading. Jasmine leaned forward, brows tightening. "Reading what?" she asked. "King, Baldwin, Angela Davis." One was reading out loud when the officer grabbed her mid-sentence. Something inside Jasmine went still. She minimized her open casework and pulled up the link Elise sent. It was a live stream, shaky, low quality, but damningly clear. The protesters sat in a quiet line, backs straight, signs on their laps, their voices no louder than conversation. No bullhorns, no chanting. Just words, measured, intentional. Then through the corner of the frame, Officer Trent Walsh entered. No PA system, no crowd dispersal protocol. His lips moved, barely audible over the street noise. And within seconds, his hands were on a woman's arm. She stumbled, her book still open, still reading as he dragged her to her feet. That woman, Marissa Elkins, was a local art teacher. Jasmine would learn later that she'd brought her students posters to paint that morning. She didn't even finish her sentence before she was in cuffs. Jasmine paused the video and sat perfectly still. No blinking, no motion. She knew this setup. She'd seen it before, where fear of disruption becomes more dangerous than any disruption itself. The arrest reports were sloppy, identical language in all six, as if cut and pasted by someone who assumed no one would ever look twice. Trespassing, refusing to comply. 3 verbal warnings. Jasmine played the video again. There were no 3 warnings, not even close. 1 muttered command, 1 flash of impatience, and then escalation. The pattern was obvious and the intent behind it even more so. She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed, and said aloud to no one, "They thought no one would care." A few moments later, she was on the phone with the community office. "Send me the names, full reports, all video footage." Every scrap. Elise hesitated. "Just so you know, the local press isn't covering it. The DA's calling it routine enforcement." Jasmine's voice dropped. "It's never routine when a citizen gets arrested for reading." Her fingers tapped the desk twice. Her tone was cold steel. "This isn't a minor case. It's a stress test. For the system, for the court, and for me." As the city dimmed into silence, her office became a war room. A single desk lamp cast sharp shadows over stacks of legal books, notepads filled with red ink scribbles, and a monitor replaying the footage on loop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, searching, cross-referencing, digging through federal databases like a surgeon working through bone. Not the big-name cases everyone quoted. Those were too broad, too diluted. She hunted for the buried ones, forgotten precedents, uncelebrated decisions with surgical language. Holder v. Community Network, Donovan v. Metro PD Serrano v. Falcon Ridge Corporation. Each case obscure, each one a scalpel. Together they formed a legal structure the court wouldn't see coming. They didn't make headlines, but they had teeth, and Jasmine sharpened every one of them. Every citation she wrote had purpose. Every footnote was a fuse. She wasn't just building a defense. She was laying down a legal minefield, one precise enough that any attempt to bulldoze it would explode in contradiction. She marked timestamps from the video and aligned them with claims from the arrest reports. She underlined discrepancies. She printed out excerpts from depositions that most lawyers would have ignored. The officer's claim of 3 clear warnings was ripped apart second by second until it was nothing but an empty excuse. As midnight crawled past and her office buzzed with quiet tension, Jasmine never looked at the clock. She wasn't tired, she was furious, and that fury was fuel. By 3:17 a.m., her opening statement was finished. By 4:10, her motion to dismiss was printed, clipped, and annotated. By sunrise, the legal brief on her desk was heavier than any weapon and twice as dangerous. She sat back in her chair, eyes burning, back aching, but her heart steady. The law was supposed to be the great equalizer, but lately it had become a wall, with power on one side and silence on the other. Jasmine wasn't just there to knock on it, she was ready to crack it open. Because she knew that in a courtroom rigged to rush the unheard out the back door, her job wasn't just to speak, it was to make them listen, whether they wanted to or not. By the time the courtroom reconvened, Jasmine was no longer just a defense attorney. She was a storm walking into a room full of lightning rods. Her overnight prep was now weaponized, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had loaded every chamber. She approached the bench with precision, her binder thick with highlighted exhibits and time-stamped transcripts. Her voice, though steady, carried a different weight now, measured, deliberate, surgical. "Your Honor," she began, her voice as crisp as a paper snap, "I will walk this court through 3 essential facts, none of which have been disputed by evidence, and all of which directly undermine the foundation of the prosecution's charges." She slid the first document forward, an annotated diagram of the building's entryway. First, there was no obstruction. The front steps of Northern Star Oil are ungated, open to public foot traffic, and commonly used as a pedestrian pass-through. No doors were blocked, no entrances interfered. This is confirmed by both the building schematics and property usage permits filed with the city. She tapped the highlighted sections. My clients didn't cross into a restricted zone. They sat in a space accessible to every employee, visitor, and passerby. The judge didn't interrupt. Jasmine continued, flipping to the next section of her binder with surgical calm. Second, there was no official warning issued in compliance with law enforcement protocol. Officer Walsh's arrest report claims he gave 3 loud verbal directives, but the body cam footage tells a different story. She stepped to the evidence monitor, played a 10-second clip. Walsh's voice was barely audible over the traffic. "You have to move," he says once. Then within 4 seconds, he reaches down and yanks Marissa Elkins by the wrist. Jasmine paused the video. No megaphone, no repeated command, no waiting period. That is not lawful procedure. That is an officer acting out of impatience or instruction he never received from anyone in authority. She returned to the defense table and held up a single page, a sworn affidavit. Third, she said, locking eyes with Judge Forrester, there was no request for police intervention from the property itself. Her voice stayed calm, but it tightened like a drawn bow. This affidavit from Gerard Blanche, Director of Security at Northern Star, states clearly, no disruption was reported, no entrances were blocked, and no formal complaint was filed. Police were not summoned by management. They were responding to a phone call from a tenant on the 5th floor, someone unaffiliated with building operations. The room held still, not silent in the theatrical way, but in the heavy, paralyzed kind of way, where even the air seems to wait for what comes next. Jasmine lowered the affidavit slowly. So what does that leave us with, Your Honor? Citizens sitting peacefully on public access steps. No warning, no request for removal, no disruption, and yet arrests were made. Her tone sharpened, but never rose. If this court proceeds under the assumption that such behavior constitutes criminal conduct, we are no longer enforcing law, we are enforcing silence. But just as Jasmine's final words settled into the still air, weighty and irrefutable, someone tried to laugh it off. Predictably, it was Leland Briggs. The assistant district attorney had been quiet too long, and now he looked like a man forced into a fight he hadn't trained for. He adjusted his cuffs, cleared his throat a little too theatrically, and rose to his feet with the slow confidence of someone clinging to title more than truth. Your Honor, he began, forcing a casual smile, let's not pretend this is something it's not. He turned slightly, just enough to angle his body toward Jasmine, but not enough to face her directly. Ms. Crockett is clearly very passionate, and I respect passion, but we're not here to debate philosophy or rewrite constitutional history. He chuckled, an empty, dry laugh that echoed too loudly in the room. This is a simple case. These individuals were asked to leave. They didn't. That's trespassing. We're not dealing with some sweeping First Amendment issue. We're dealing with basic refusal to comply. He shrugged, glancing at the judge, as if seeking reassurance, as if trying to remind the court that the script had already been written and all Jasmine had done was stray off cue. He waved toward her binder like it was an overdue library book. And with all due respect, Your Honor, citing cases from different jurisdictions, especially ones with no binding authority here, is more creative writing than legal argument. The smirk on his face wasn't subtle. It was the kind of look you give when you think you've already won and just need to wrap things up. Let's not confuse the issue with academic hypotheticals. These defendants broke the law, plain and simple. The room didn't move. No heads nodded. No pens scribbled. If anything, the silence thickened. Because everyone in that room knew what had just happened. Even if Briggs didn't. He hadn't addressed the facts. He hadn't countered the affidavits, the video evidence, or the lack of procedural compliance. Instead, he tried to shrink Jasmine down to emotion, to make her seem like the angry voice in a courtroom that preferred calm submission. But what he failed to see, what made the tension so sharp it could cut, was that Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once, and yet every word she spoke had landed like a hammer. Briggs had sound, Jasmine had substance, and the difference was starting to show. And as Briggs sank back into his chair, proud of his hollow performance, all eyes turned to Judge Randall Forrester. The man who could end this with a single sentence. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because beneath his furrowed brow and clenched jaw, something far more dangerous was happening. Doubt. Forrester shifted in his chair like the leather had suddenly become too tight. His fingers drummed once against the wood of the bench, then stopped. He glanced down at the affidavit Jasmine had presented, still lying in front of him like an accusation. His nostrils flared, not in anger but in conflict. Everything in his posture screamed resistance, but not to her logic, to the fact that her logic left him nowhere to stand. He wanted to shut her down, to swat her arguments aside like he'd done to dozens of lawyers before her. But this time, there was no opening, no misstep, no grandstanding he could latch onto. Just line after line of clear constitutional structure, cold, sharp, and undeniable. His discomfort wasn't loud, but it was visible. A slight twitch in his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed when she spoke, the way he gripped the edge of his bench just a little too hard, like holding on to authority by the fingertips. He hated how clean her argument was, how unshakable, how she had backed him into a corner without raising her voice or even breaking rhythm. Because in this courtroom, his courtroom, Forrester wasn't used to being the one on the defensive. And now, with every quiet word Jasmine spoke, the authority he wore like a robe was starting to feel a little too thin. But the real blow didn't come from cross-examination, or a viral clip, or a courtroom outburst. It came from a single page buried deep inside the prosecution's own file, unmarked, unhighlighted, almost forgotten. And when Judge Forrester's eyes found it, everything in the room changed. He was flipping through the folder methodically, trying to maintain the rhythm of control. Skim, flip, glance, dismiss. But then something caught. A paragraph halfway down an affidavit, the kind of document most judges skim without thought. He paused. His eyes scanned the lines once, then again, slower, as if the words might shift if read too quickly. You could see the moment it hit him. His brow tightened, his posture stiffened. And then he read it aloud, voice lower than usual, not in performance but in weight. At the time of the protest, he began, eyes still locked on the page, no building entrances were obstructed. There was no physical damage. Protesters remained seated on the front steps and did not interfere with building operations. Law enforcement was not requested by property management. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst could have been. Every face turned toward the bench, waiting, not for judgment, but for reaction. The irony was suffocating. This wasn't a defense strategy. It wasn't a hidden trick. This was their own evidence, quietly damning, overlooked by a system too eager to convict before it listened. Jasmine stood motionless, not triumphant, not smug, just steady, like she had already seen this moment play out in her mind. Because she had. She trusted the truth would outlast the noise. And now it stood in Forrester's hand, undeniable. He didn't speak right away. His eyes didn't leave the document. It was as if every rigid rule he lived by, the ones that told him who was credible, who was disruptive, who belonged, had just been called into question by a memo tucked between bureaucratic pages. For a man like Judge Forrester, doubt was the real punishment. His authority wasn't shaken by force. It was eroded by a fact he couldn't argue with. Slowly his gaze lifted to Jasmine. There was no glare this time, no scolding, just the heavy stillness of a man realizing that maybe, just maybe, he'd gotten this one wrong from the start. And there it was. Not surrender, but hesitation. The first crack in a wall built too high, too long, and too confidently. The affidavit still lay on the bench like an open wound in the prosecution's case, but Judge Forrester wasn't looking at it anymore. He was looking at her, at Jasmine Crockett. Something in his gaze had changed, less rigid, more searching, like a man trying to reconcile the person in front of him with something buried in memory. And then, without warning, his voice dropped an octave. Controlled, curious. "Ms. Crockett," he said, slow and deliberate, "did you represent a tenant in the Pathfinder case back in 2015? His words hung in the air, not an accusation, not a compliment, but something heavier, something personal. Jasmine's expression didn't change. No pride, no nostalgia, just clarity. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, steady as ever. She didn't offer details. She didn't need to, because the room had shifted again, and this time it wasn't tension. It was revelation. Forrester leaned back slightly, staring not at his papers, but at her. That name, Pathfinder, it hadn't crossed his mind in years. But now it flooded back. The tenant advocacy lawsuit that came out of nowhere and blindsided a county full of complacent officials. A case dismissed by many at first glance. Just another legal skirmish over rent control and unfair eviction notices. Until one young attorney tore the entire foundation out from under it with nothing but zoning code, municipal policy, and a voice that never cracked once. He remembered reading the ruling. It was tight, clinical, no fluff, no drama. But beneath it was something unmistakable, a surgical dismantling of systemic neglect. He remembered thinking, who the hell wrote this? Now, standing in his courtroom, was his answer. Jasmine Crockett. He looked at her again, but this time, not as an overzealous defense lawyer stretching the Constitution. Not as a woman trying to prove a point. He saw a strategist, a tactician, someone who'd fought this system before and left it changed in her wake. It wasn't admiration, not yet, but it was the beginning of something rare for a man like Forrester. Respect. The grudging kind. The kind that doesn't come from charisma or status, but from impact, from legacy. And suddenly, every sharp word he'd thrown at her earlier began to echo differently in his mind. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't someone making noise. Maybe this was someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure, and right now she was doing it without raising her voice, without flinching, and without giving him a single excuse to strike back. And with the affidavit still resting on the bench like a mirror no one wanted to look into, Judge Forrester sat in a silence of his own making. Not the silence of power, but the silence that follows the recognition of failure. He glanced once more at the documents before him, then at Jasmine, who stood still and calm, the embodiment of everything this courtroom tried to minimize. And then finally he spoke. His voice was lower now, not defeated, but stripped of the weight it once carried. After reviewing the full record, he said slowly, each word deliberate, each pause loaded, and considering the sworn statement provided by the property's security director, the lack of procedural compliance by the arresting officer, and the absence of any actual obstruction or threat, a breath. Just one. He looked down, then up. This court finds no legal basis to proceed. All 6 charges are dismissed with prejudice. There it was. A sharp exhale rippled across the room, but no one dared interrupt. He wasn't done. Furthermore, he continued, eyes now locked on Jasmine, the contempt citation issued earlier is vacated and expunged from the record. This court recognizes the argument presented was grounded in constitutional precedent. The gavel dropped, not with anger, but finality. A dull thud that didn't just end a hearing, it ended a storm. No applause followed. No outburst, just stillness, like everyone in that courtroom had witnessed something too precise to cheer for. This wasn't theater. This was a reckoning, a recalibration. The prosecutor sat frozen, his notes untouched. The clerk glanced up, unsure if she was supposed to type anything else. In the gallery, no one moved. Even the fluorescent lights, always buzzing faintly above, seemed quieter now, as if the room itself understood what had just happened. Jasmine didn't move right away. She let the silence do its work. She let the judge feel what it meant to say those words, not just legally, but morally. Then she reached for her binder, closed it with a soft click, and turned without a single wasted motion. Her clients looked at her like someone who had just pulled them back from a ledge they didn't even realize they were standing on. But she didn't smile. She didn't soak in victory. Because this wasn't victory, it was correction. She walked past the prosecution table without a glance, past the rows of watchers who no longer saw a defense attorney. They saw a force, not loud, not flamboyant, but relentless. And as she crossed the threshold of the courtroom doors, she didn't look back. No robe, no badge, no ceremonial armor. Just truth in her voice, law in her hands, and a presence that couldn't be ignored. Jasmine Crockett left that courtroom like a warrior whose greatest weapon was silence sharpened by evidence, whose armor was reason, and whose battlefield was every place injustice thought no one was paying attention. She didn't need to win loudly. She had already won where it mattered most, in the place where power had to pause and listen. And just when it seemed like the story had ended, charges dismissed, gavel dropped, courtroom emptied, Jasmine Crockett found herself face to face with the man who had tried to silence her. Not in the courtroom, not behind the bench, but in the hallway outside, where titles don't echo and robes have no armor. The corridor was narrow, lined with peeling paint and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Jasmine walked calmly, her binder tucked under one arm, steps steady, not hurried. She didn't expect to be stopped, certainly not by him. But there he was, Judge Randall Forrester, no longer robed, no longer towering behind a bench. Just a man in shirt sleeves, tie slightly loosened, holding his jacket in one hand and something heavier in the other. Reflection. His eyes weren't sharp anymore. They were tired but not defeated, thoughtful but not soft. He looked like a man who had walked into that courtroom certain of the world and walked out unsure if he'd ever seen it clearly at all. He didn't speak right away. For a moment, they just stood there. Two professionals who had just shared a battlefield where only one walked away with clarity. Then finally he broke the silence. "I used to teach procedural law," he said, voice quieter than it had ever been inside that courtroom. "Back then, I told my students something I believed with my whole chest." He looked straight at her now. "I told them, don't get too creative with civil rights arguments. The court doesn't care about poetry." There was no bite in his tone, no sarcasm, just honesty, and a hint of something that sounded like regret. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't take the bait. She just met his gaze with the same stillness she had carried into his courtroom hours earlier. "Do you still believe that?" she asked evenly, like a question she already knew the answer to. The hallway buzzed faintly around them, but in that moment, everything else faded. Forrester didn't respond right away. His mouth opened, then shut again. He looked down at his shoes, then back at her. The pause wasn't theatrical. It was real, thoughtful, earned. And then, with a voice that had lost its usual command, he said, "I'm starting to think it depends on who's delivering it." There was no applause, no music, no closing line to signal a clear-cut victory. What passed between them wasn't approval. It was a shift, a recalibration of power, the beginning of something far rarer than praise, recognition. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken because it sits in the silence between two people who know the game, know the rules, and know when those rules have been rewritten. Jasmine nodded once, barely. She didn't thank him. He hadn't offered a favor. She didn't gloat. There was no need. This wasn't about winning. It was about being seen, not as a troublemaker, not as noise, not as a line in someone else's narrative, but as exactly what she was, a strategist, a builder of arguments, a voice that refused to echo but insisted on impact. Judge Forrester exhaled slowly, a sound that said more than words could. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to explain away what had happened in that courtroom, and that, in its own way, was the most honest thing he could have done. Because the truth was clear now, etched between every line of motion and stillness, between every word said and everyone held back. He had underestimated her, and it would never happen again. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and turned to go, leaving Jasmine standing in the same place where, hours earlier, she had walked in expected to lose. She didn't watch him leave. She didn't need to. Because when someone like Forrester, fortress of the system, wall of tradition, gives you that kind of admission, even without calling it one, you don't chase it. You let it land, and then you carry it with you, not as a trophy, but as proof that pressure, applied precisely, changes even the most immovable stone. She walked away a moment later, not faster, not prouder, just the same measured pace. The hallway behind her faded into quiet, but everything about that silence had changed, because now every step forward wasn't just hers. It belonged to the people who had been silenced before her, to the ones still sitting outside systems that don't believe they belong, and to the ones who would watch her from afar and think, if she stood, maybe I can too. That moment in the hallway didn't make headlines. It didn't go viral. But it was the turning point no one saw coming. Not when the law cracked open, not when justice was shouted, but when a judge with power looked at a woman he once dismissed and saw, finally, the gravity of her presence. No robe, no bench, no gavel. Just truth, standing eye to eye. Outside, the courthouse had grown quiet. The crowd had thinned, the tension dissolved into late afternoon light, but Jasmine Crockett hadn't left yet. The battle was over, at least in the legal sense. But some lessons don't echo in closing statements. They settle in quieter places. And for one young man sitting across from her, the fight had left more questions than answers. Nico sat stiffly at the small cafe table across from Jasmine, his hands still tight around a paper coffee cup he hadn't sipped from. His shirt was wrinkled from hours on courtroom benches, his notepad filled with shaky lines and half-written thoughts. He had watched her dismantle a case, shift the power of a courtroom, and walk away with her head high. But now, under the soft shade of a sidewalk umbrella, he looked more shaken than awed. His voice came low, edged with confusion. "How?" he asked. "How did you not lose it? When he fined you, when he cut you off, when he looked at you like you didn't belong there?" I was ready to shout. "You didn't even blink." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her blazer folded beside her, a glass of untouched tea sweating slowly on the table. She didn't answer right away. She let the question linger, like everything else she'd done that day, measured, deliberate. Finally, her voice broke the pause. "Because the court doesn't respond to outrage," she said quietly. "It responds to structure. It doesn't care how offended I am. It doesn't hear pain. It hears precedent." Nico frowned, still gripping his cup, still trying to process. "But it was personal," he said. "Everything about how he treated you, the fine, the tone. He didn't treat you like a lawyer. He treated you like a nuisance." Jasmine nodded once. "He did," she said, "and I knew he would." She glanced out toward the street, where 2 protest signs leaned forgotten against a bench. "That's the first rule of fighting in a room built to exclude you. Don't play the part they've written for you." He wanted emotion. He wanted volume. I gave him facts. I gave him something he couldn't strike down without revealing his own bias. She turned back to Nico, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "You want to change the system?" she asked. "Then you need to understand the system. You need to learn its language, its weaknesses, its blind spots. You don't walk into a courtroom like a storm and expect justice to bow. You walk in like a scalpel and you cut precisely where it bleeds." Her words landed with the weight of truth, not performance. Nico looked down, humbled, overwhelmed. "But you were alone up there," he said, voice quieter. "Everyone was against you. The judge, the prosecutor. Half the room didn't even look you in the eye." Jasmine's mouth twitched. Not a smile, but something more tired. "I wasn't alone," she replied. "I had the Constitution, I had the law, and I had 6 people counting on me to speak when they couldn't." She picked up her glass but didn't drink. "You don't need the room to like you. You don't even need them to believe you. You just need to be undeniable." Nico stared at her, the gears in his head turning. "So you just buried your anger?" he asked. "You swallowed it?" Jasmine shook her head. "No, I transformed it. Anger is energy. You can burn the room down with it, or you can power every word, every footnote, every objection. One is loud, the other is lasting." She leaned forward now, her elbows resting on the table. "And if you want to last, Nico, you better learn how to let silence do your talking." The wind shifted. The signs on the bench fluttered. Jasmine looked at them for a long moment. "They think silence means weakness," she said, "but it's the most powerful thing you can wield when the words are already buried in law. I don't raise my voice because I don't need to. I've already built the argument. My job is to make sure no one can ignore it." Nico looked down at his notepad. For the first time that day, he didn't write anything. He just listened, because the fight wasn't about what was said in the courtroom anymore. It was about what would be remembered afterward. "I want to be like that," he said finally. "I want to be able to stand there the way you did. Calm, sharp, unshakable." Jasmine looked at him, her expression softening. "Then start by learning the law better than anyone who doubts you. Read the rulings no one quotes. Study the judges. Know their records, their logic, their limits. And when they try to dismiss you, don't shout, don't plead. Just drop the truth like a stone and let them feel the weight of ignoring it. He nodded slowly, not with eagerness, but with understanding. Do you ever get tired of it? He asked. Jasmine looked out toward the street again. A delivery truck rumbled by, drowning her answer for a second. When it passed, she said, all the time. But I get more tired watching people lose because no one showed up for them. Because someone got scared, or someone got tired, or someone got talked over and stopped talking altogether. The cafe was quiet now. The world moved on around them, unaware of what had just unfolded inside that courtroom, unaware of what had been broken and what had been restored. Jasmine stood, gathered her things. It's not about being loud, she said. It's about being clear, being unshakable, and being ready when it's your turn to speak. Nico stood too, still holding his notes. I don't think I'm ready, he admitted. She smiled, small but real. You're not supposed to be, not yet, but you came. You watched, you asked, that's where it starts. She turned to go, then paused. One day someone will ask you the same question you just asked me, and when they do, don't give them a speech. Give them structure. Give them something they can hold on to when the whole room tries to shake them loose. And then she was gone. No headlines, no spotlight, just footsteps on concrete, and the echo of something stronger than applause. Understanding. Nico looked down at the blank page in his notebook and finally wrote one word. Listen. As Jasmine turned the corner away from the cafe, the echo of Nico's quiet listen still pulsing behind her like the aftershock of a lesson just beginning, she paused near the edge of the courthouse steps. The day was beginning to dissolve into evening, shadows stretching across the pavement like quiet reminders of what had unfolded inside those stone walls. And then, just beyond the fountain at the square's edge, two young girls appeared, barely teenagers, still wearing backpacks slung over one shoulder, holding homemade protest signs cut from recycled cardboard. They weren't part of any legal team. They hadn't been inside the courtroom. They didn't know Jasmine's name. They didn't even look twice at her. But what they carried was louder than any verdict. One sign read, "We have the right to be heard." The other, "Silence is not a crime." Their markers had smudged a little, and the edges of their signs curled under the weight of tape and heat, but their grip on the wooden handles was firm. Young hands that hadn't yet learned how often power tries to erase them. They walked past her without hesitation, chatting between themselves about school, a teacher they didn't like, a video someone posted. To them, it was just another walk home from a protest, just another afternoon of standing for something that felt too big, too distant, too system-sized to truly touch. But Jasmine watched them go, her eyes fixed not on their innocence, but on their courage. They didn't know what had just been defended in that courtroom. They didn't know that their signs, their words, their very right to be present and vocal had been placed under threat and pulled back from the edge by someone they'd never meet. And Jasmine didn't need them to know. That was never the point. She didn't do it for thanks. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because someone had to hold the line when no one else would. And sometimes the best victories are the ones that pass by unnoticed, quiet, uncelebrated, but enduring. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply stood there, shoulders square, eyes steady, feet planted like roots through concrete. The courthouse loomed behind her, its walls no longer quite as immovable as they once seemed. And she became, in that moment, what the system never expected her to be. A presence it couldn't erase. A still point in a churning storm. A fixed truth in a world where policy often bends to pressure and power pretends not to hear. Jasmine stood like a monument the city hadn't commissioned, anchored, silent, but absolutely unyielding. She had walked through the storm and refused to be moved by it. Now she stood outside the very building that had tried to flatten her under precedent and perception, and she knew exactly what she had protected. It wasn't just 6 defendants. It wasn't just a handful of citations. It was the very idea that voices, even the smallest ones, matter. That expression, no matter how inconvenient, is not a threat. That silence isn't guilt. It's a strategy. And sometimes it's survival. The girls disappeared down the block, their signs swaying at their sides like flags after a quiet battle. Jasmine turned her head slightly, just enough to follow them with her eyes, then looked away. She didn't need to follow. They were safe now, not because the world had changed, but because today, in one courtroom, the rules had been reminded of their purpose. She took a slow breath and let it sit deep in her chest, anchoring herself like she had all day, not to anger, not to fear, but to certainty. Because real justice doesn't roar, it resonates. And Jasmine Crockett, she was its echo, the kind that doesn't fade, no matter how far the storm travels. Justice, Jasmine would tell you, is never granted by a sudden flash of light or a single heroic shout. It is carved inch by inch out of stubborn stone. And that is the first brutal lesson this case leaves behind. Systems survive on momentum, and momentum can be broken only when someone is willing to grind against it long after applause would have died. She walked into that courtroom armed with footnotes, timestamps, and an iron refusal to be hurried, proving that rage, if poured straight into procedure, becomes a blade protocol cannot dull. The lesson is stark. Do not waste fury screaming at the walls. Spend it tracing every crack, every hidden bolt, because the wall will never crumble simply because it offends you. It will crumble when you prove it was built on bad math. Jasmine's triumph shows that emotion may start the engine, but only structure drives it to the finish line, and drama without documentation is just noise that power has learned to tune out. In a world where shouting is cheap and viral outrage lasts 24 hours, precision is the quiet weapon that keeps cutting long after hashtags fade. Her story instructs us that mismatched expectations, believing moral clarity alone should sway a judge, are exactly what systems rely on. They anticipate anger because anger is easier to dismiss than evidence. Jasmine inverted that expectation, turning every slight, every contempt fine into fuel for greater focus. And by the time the gavel dropped, even the man who brandished it had to concede that discipline outlasts dominance. The second lesson is grimly practical. Oppression often travels in the mundane paperwork nobody bothers to read. So real warriors study that paperwork like it holds the secret codes, and it does. Hidden inside the prosecution's own file was the affidavit that shattered their narrative, a single slip of paper so damning it waited like a sleeping landmine for the first person meticulous enough to uncover it. Jasmine teaches that diligence is an act of rebellion, that poring over footnotes at 3 a.m. can be more subversive than chanting in the street, because bureaucracy counts on your exhaustion. She weaponized the state's laziness against itself, turning their unexamined affidavit into a confession signed in ink. The message lands hard: never trust the surface summary. Dig until the evidence either stands or dies in your hands, and if the state won't do that work, make their negligence your strongest witness. Injustice, stripped of preparation, stands naked. The only reason it often survives is because no one has the patience to undress it. A third, quieter takeaway lurks beneath the drama. Identities that power labels volatile, women, minorities, the young, become unstoppable precisely when they refuse the emotional script written for them. Jasmine knew the courtroom expected her to bristle, to crack, to confirm every stereotype that would justify dismissing her argument. So she countered by draining her voice of visible anger and filling it with calibrated certainty. She left the emotional weight hanging over the prosecution's table instead, forcing them to sputter with condescension while she methodically documented their contradictions. The result is a tactical principle. When a system anticipates your fury, starve it. When it anticipates your silence, speak, but always on your terms, never on theirs. By refusing the bait, Jasmine made Forrester's contempt charge feel petty, almost juvenile, and when the fine evaporated, it was his credibility that thinned, not hers. The injustice she faced wasn't just legal, it was a social narrative eager to shrink her. She beat it by refusing to fit the frame. Then there is the strategic lesson of audience. Jasmine was never truly debating Forrester or Briggs. She was documenting them for a future panel of appellate judges, for the press that might eventually read those transcripts, for every junior lawyer like Nico who will shape tomorrow's courts. She played a longer game than the room could see, And that is why she asked for the fine's rationale for the appellate record. A subtle reminder that today's decision-makers are accountable to tomorrow's scrutiny. This adds an urgent moral. When justice is deferred, ensure the record is your ally, because the record lives longer than any judge's temper. If power must ignore you now, force it to confront you later in black and white, where emotion dissolves and logic remains. Jasmine didn't just win dismissal. She built a case study that will haunt future prosecutors who try the same shortcut, and that echo may free more voices than the 6 she defended. Impact, she proves, is exponential when built on a paper trail. The story also hammers home a chilling truth about state force. The faster an officer moves from command to cuffs, the more essential it becomes to pause the video frame by frame until the lie is visible. Officer Walsh acted within seconds, an interval short enough that most viewers would blink and miss the violation. But Jasmine slowed that footage until every skipped warning was undeniable. Her insistence invites us to see technology not as spectacle, but as microscope. Zoom in, isolate, rewind, because power hides in speed. In that courtroom, time itself became evidence, and the state learned that seconds matter when freedom turns on procedure. For every reader, the implication is clear. Record everything, annotate everything, audit everything, because the system counts on motion blur to disguise misconduct. Jasmine's cross-referencing of timestamps and oral reports dismantled a narrative built on assumed authority, and that technique is replicable. Courage paired with technology can catch impunity mid-stride and pin it to the wall. Another enduring message radiates from Forrester's late-day transformation. Even entrenched authority can shift, but not through humiliation, through incontrovertible logic that leaves it no honorable escape except concession. Jasmine did not seek to embarrass the judge. She boxed him in with facts so precise that retreating from them would have stained his robe more than conceding. That moment underscores a bittersweet hope. Systems can evolve, not because they grow hearts, but because someone makes the cost of ignorance exceed the cost of change. Yet it also warns reformers to keep their swords sheathed until the cut counts. If she'd mocked him when he wavered, he might have doubled down. Mercy, in that fragile instant, was a tactical choice yielding maximal impact. Forrester walked away, not humiliated, but enlightened enough to rethink his old lecture lines about poetry and civil rights. That subtle victory suggests that persuading power often requires sparing its pride, so it can pivot without shattering completely. The narrative further delivers a civic directive. Bystanders may never clap, the gallery may remain stone-faced, but apathy is not proof your fight is futile. The spectators in Jasmine's courtroom seemed unmoved, yet hours later, 2 teenage girls marched by with handmade signs echoing the very rights she defended. Change, the story insists, often travels unseen, germinating in the silence after a verdict, blooming later in places you'll never stand. Therefore, measure success not by cheers, but by aftershocks. A policy memo revised, a protest unharassed, a young intern scribbling "listen" with renewed purpose. If you judge your worth by immediate accolades, the system has already won because it controls the room's reactions. Jasmine's composure demonstrates a deeper payoff. Endurance is its own applause, and unseen beneficiaries are the most profound standing ovation a fighter for rights can earn. The injustice Jasmine confronted, being fined for citing precedent, being labeled political for quoting constitutional text, highlights another principle. Oppression often disguises itself as procedural efficiency, accusing dissent of wasting the court's time. Her victory reminds us that expedience can be tyranny's best friend, trimming debates short before truth can breathe. Every citizen must therefore interrogate calls for keeping things moving when lives and liberties are on the line. Efficiency is admirable only when paired with equity. Jasmine slowed the process intentionally, forcing the court to linger on inconvenient evidence, proving that real justice requires endurance, not haste. Thus, the moral lands hard. When power says, "Hurry up," ask, "Who benefits from my silence?" Because the slow work of scrutiny may be the only shield the vulnerable possess. For activists, the tale offers tactical contrast. Passion in the streets must be mirrored by precision in the courts. or else one side of the battlefront remains undefended. The 6 protesters read speeches aloud. Jasmine translated those speeches into legal arguments that survival demands. A dual strike that protects bodies in public and rights on paper. She shows movements that chanting alone is fragile unless matched by attorneys who can encode chants into statutes and holdings. Likewise, lawyers isolated from on-the-ground struggle risk drafting beautiful briefs no one in the streets recognizes. The synergy between visible protest and invisible litigation is where sustainable power grows, and Jasmine's intervention illustrates that loop. Street energy alerted her office. Her ruling now safeguards future street energy. The circle tightens. Protest fuels precedent. Precedent shields protest. So every organizer and attorney should see themselves not as separate forces, but as alternating beats of the same drum. Personal resilience also pulses through the narrative. Jasmine operated on minimal sleep, under direct disrespect, and still maintained clinical clarity, proof that discipline over one's internal state can neutralize external hostility. When the judge's contempt fine thundered, it was meant to unbalance her. Instead, it underscored her balance. That steadiness isn't supernatural, it's practiced. A muscle built by countless smaller confrontations, where she learned to treat slight as signal, insult as data, emotion as fuel. Viewers must grasp that poise is trainable. Anyone willing to confront discomfort repeatedly can eventually stand where she stood. The human lesson, then, is not that Jasmine is exceptional beyond reach, but that excellence is the product of repeated choice. Show up, stay calm, do the work, let the facts speak. Her calm became the loudest voice in the room precisely because she trained herself to hear evidence over ego, a mental regimen every aspiring advocate can adopt. Finally, the story fires a warning flare. Rights erode not in cataclysms, but in quiet moments when no one is paying attention. The one officer who skips a warning, the one judge who rushes a hearing, the one affidavit that goes unread. Jasmine's vigilance illustrates how quickly those small slips snowball into precedent capable of crushing entire movements. Each missed objection becomes tomorrow's accepted shortcut. Therefore, the narrative implores citizens to treat every minor infraction as a seed of larger harm. Pull it out while it's still small. Waiting for grand injustice before engaging is a losing strategy because by then the rules will have been rewritten in the dark. Jasmine caught the breach early, and by stitching that fissure closed, she preserved structural integrity for countless unknown voices. The lasting directive is simple but stern. Guard the small edges or lose the whole field. In the end, Jasmine Crockett's battle is both cautionary tale and rallying cry, a demonstration that systems bend only under consistent, evidence-driven pressure, and a reassurance that such pressure can indeed be applied by individuals armed with knowledge and patience. She faced sexism, racial bias, and institutional inertia, all real, all formidable, but none immune to relentless logic. Her saga admonishes each bystander to choose their role. Spectator or scalpel, echo or anchor, roar or resonance, because there will always be another Officer Walsh, another hurried judge, another set of charges meant to silence dissent. The question is whether there will be enough Jasmines prepared to stand like fixed points in that storm. The humanistic message is as clear as it is demanding. Know the rules so well that you can weaponize them against anyone who wields them unjustly. Hold your ground without surrendering your voice, and remember that the quiet victories you secure today may be the sound someone else finally hears when they fear the whole world has gone deaf. And if Jasmine Crockett's story leaves you stirred, if something inside you shifted while watching her stand alone, unflinching, in a room built to bury voices, then the next question is not what happened, but what now? Because stories like hers aren't just meant to be remembered. They're meant to be answered. This isn't the end of a courtroom drama. It's the start of a blueprint, a call, a warning, a chance. Somewhere right now, another protester is being cuffed without cause. Another judge is preparing to dismiss arguments they haven't even heard. Another young attorney is being told to stay quiet, to wait their turn, to not make waves. If that bothers you, and it should, then it's time to stop watching from the gallery. It's time to take a seat at the table, even if no one offers you one. It's time to build your voice into something that can't be muted by fear, by force, or by procedure disguised as fairness. Start with this. Learn the law, not the version handed down in headlines, but the real one, ugly, complicated, coded in language designed to keep outsiders outside. Understand the rules so deeply that you can bend them back toward justice without breaking them. Study the cases that never made the front page, the footnotes, the dissenting opinions. Arm yourself with knowledge so precise it can't be ignored, so sharp it makes even the most stubborn gavel hesitate before falling. Don't just be angry, be prepared. Anger burns fast, but strategy survives. Jasmine didn't walk into that courtroom with fury. She walked in with receipts, with timelines, with federal precedents barely used but perfectly placed. That's not talent, that's work. And if she can do it, so can you. If you're a student, read more. If you're a lawyer, fight harder. If you're an activist, record everything. If you're a citizen, show up. To hearings, to town halls, to protests where no one's watching yet, to the ballot box when it's not trending. And if you've never been inside a courtroom, go sit in one. Watch how language is used as a weapon. See how often silence is mistaken for guilt. And if that silence looks familiar, if it sounds like someone you know, or someone who looks like you, or someone no one listens to, then you already have a reason to act. Don't wait until it's your name on the docket to care. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a case, she issued a challenge to every person who believes in fairness, to every voice that's been told it's too much or too little, to every young fighter who thinks they're not ready. She proved that readiness isn't about confidence. It's about clarity, about knowing what's right and refusing to let the world forget it. So if you've been waiting for a sign, this is it. The system doesn't change when it's asked politely. It changes when someone walks in with enough truth to rattle its bones. Be that someone. Be quiet if you must, but never be invisible. Be unshakable. Be precise. Be undeniable. The storm isn't coming. It's already here. And justice doesn't need more spectators. It needs anchors. It needs Jasmines. It needs you. When a poor black woman was nearly evicted over a forged notice, no one expected her defense attorney to be a young stranger in cheap shoes. But that nobody was Jasmine Crockett, an undercover legal powerhouse. In just one hearing, she exposed a corrupt judge, a fraudulent landlord, and over 200 illegal evictions. What made her risk everything? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom was old, but its walls still held the scent of power. Worn wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, most of them locals. Many familiar faces, some just curious. The ceiling fan above turned lazily, as if even it couldn't muster energy for what was supposed to be a routine eviction hearing. Judge Malcolm Warren took his seat with a heavy thud of authority, his robe swishing like the curtain of an old theater act he'd performed 1,000 times. He adjusted his glasses, already bored. At the plaintiff's table stood Howard Briggs, a smug attorney with silver hair and a sharper tongue, representing the landlord. Across the aisle sat Evelyn Turner, a weary, soft-spoken black woman clutching a worn leather purse, her eyes sunken from nights spent worrying about where she'd sleep next. Her alleged crime? Owing 2 months' rent, though she swore she'd paid every dime. The room buzzed with low whispers, as if justice had already made up its mind. Then the door creaked open. A young woman stepped in, petite, quiet, dressed in plain slacks and a faded blouse. No makeup, no designer handbag, just a black binder tucked beneath her arm and a quiet fire in her eyes. She didn't command attention. She absorbed it, like a storm cloud gathering energy in silence. She walked straight to Evelyn, bent down to whisper something, then stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I'll be representing Miss Turner today." The room paused. Judge Warren arched a brow, amused. Briggs chuckled openly. "And you are?" he said, voice dripping with disbelief. "Her niece? Or did legal aid send the intern today?" Laughter rippled across the room, but the young woman didn't flinch. She simply looked at the judge and said, "You can call me Jasmine." Judge Warren leaned forward. "Miss Jasmine, This court requires proper representation. Are you qualified to? I'm not required to explain myself unless challenged under procedural grounds, she replied evenly, voice razor-sharp but calm. Briggs scoffed again. Well, if this is how she's starting, we'll be home by lunch. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a waste of court time. But something in the judge's eyes flickered. Uncertainty or curiosity, perhaps. Jasmine remained standing, unshaken. Her posture was perfect, her tone measured, but her eyes, they had seen battles. She didn't come to play defense. She came to dismantle. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was who she really was. Jasmine Crockett. The Jasmine Crockett. A legal prodigy once dubbed the Iron Voice of the People by national press. She had made her name defending the forgotten, the exploited, the abandoned, and winning. But 3 years ago, she disappeared from public view, rejecting offers from big firms and networks. Rumors said she burned out. Truth was, she'd grown tired of grand stages where the real fight never reached. So she came here, to towns like this. Places where the system choked the poor slowly and no one noticed. Today wasn't a case for her. It was a reckoning. She had dressed down not because she had to, but because she wanted to be underestimated. She wanted to feel the full weight of bias, to expose how deep it ran. She wanted Warren and Briggs to dismiss her, to smirk, to laugh, because that was the only way she could rip their facade apart, piece by piece, with their own arrogance as the stage. Jasmine didn't bring theatrics. She brought truth. But truth doesn't roar when it walks in. It waits, and when it speaks, it breaks everything. And just like that, the performance began. Briggs rose from his seat with theatrical ease, brushing a non-existent speck from his tailored lapel. Since we're apparently entertaining community reps today, he began, voice thick with derision, perhaps we should start with the basics. He held up a leather-bound volume of state statutes like a relic from a holy order. Per Mississippi Tenant Statute, Section 42B, he declared, turning to face the gallery, a landlord may initiate eviction if rent is unpaid for more than 30 consecutive days. Ms. Turner, according to financial records provided and verified, has failed to pay rent for not 1, but 2 months. He paced slowly, deliberately, like a lion sizing up prey. It's not personal, he said, though the smile on his face told another story. It's just the law. He turned toward Jasmine with a smug glance. Perhaps your binder doesn't include that section? Jasmine didn't move. She didn't flinch. But the tension in the room coiled tighter, like a storm gathering force in silence. Briggs wasn't done. Let's go further, Your Honor, he said, flipping another page with a crisp snap. Section 42, B.7, Subclause C states that any delay in payment, even with partial deposits, entitles the landlord to reclaim possession, regardless of intent to pay. He let the words hang in the air like a noose. This isn't a moral issue. It's a contractual one. Ms. Turner signed a lease. She broke it. End of discussion. Judge Warren nodded slowly, lips pressed together in restrained approval. He looked to Jasmine, who remained still, calm on the outside but burning beneath. The entire room could feel it. She was surrounded, not by men, but by walls built from words, sharpened into weapons, aimed at someone the system never thought would fire back. And Briggs knew exactly what he was doing. He spoke quickly, forcefully, throwing out citations like bullets in a gunfight, hoping one would hit. The court has ruled in Morgan v. Dawson, 1994, that non-payment constitutes default, regardless of hardship. He turned a page. In Henderson Properties v. Clay, the appellate court held that equity has no place when the facts are clear. He looked at Jasmine like a man tossing a match onto dry grass. So I ask again, is this a legal argument or a dramatic plea for sympathy? Several people in the gallery nodded along. Some whispered. Jasmine could feel it, the doubt creeping in. Not hers, but theirs. The courtroom wasn't just judging her evidence. It was judging her right to even be here, to speak, to defy. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come to ask for space. She came to take it back. But just as Jasmine opened her mouth to speak, just as the room leaned in to finally hear her side, he cut her off. "Ms. Jasmine," Judge Warren snapped, raising a hand like a school principal disciplining a noisy student. His voice cracked across the courtroom like a whip. "Let's not waste the court's time with irrelevant commentary. This isn't a protest rally." Jasmine froze, not out of fear, but calculation. Her expression didn't change, but her spine straightened like steel pulling itself upright. Warren didn't stop. "I'm giving you the courtesy of standing here today, but this court requires legal facts, not emotion, not posturing." A murmur rippled across the gallery. Briggs leaned back, arms folded, lips curled into a smile that screamed, "Checkmate." It wasn't just dismissal, it was domination. And it wasn't about her argument, it was about her presence. The courtroom fell silent, but the silence was not peace, it was suppression. Jasmine looked up at Warren, eyes sharp and unwavering. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't stepped out of line. She had followed every rule, filed every paper, and stood where she was allowed to stand. Yet still, she was being swatted down like a child speaking out of turn. It was a message dressed as decorum. "You don't belong here." Her client, Evelyn, shrank in her seat, hands trembling in her lap. Jasmine saw it, felt it, how power suffocated people without ever shouting. And that was the game. Silence the voice before it starts. Strip the fire out of it with protocol. Make resistance look like disruption. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fall into their trap. Instead, she exhaled slowly, reached into her binder, and pulled out a single sheet of paper with the kind of quiet finality that sent a chill through the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, stepping forward with calm precision, "before this court continues to entertain Mr. Briggs's interpretation of legal precedent, I believe we need to first determine if this case has any standing at all." The room stilled again. Even the gallery, previously full of smirks and low laughter, grew still, as if bracing for something they didn't expect. "This," she continued, holding up the eviction notice with gloved fingers, "is the document at the center of these proceedings. It claims Ms. Turner is to be evicted due to non-payment, and is signed, so it appears, by a notary named Martha Jean Holloway." She walked the document over to the clerk's desk, then looked directly at Judge Warren. "But there's a problem, Your Honor," she said, steady and clear. "Martha Jean Holloway passed away on April 3rd, 3 years ago." She reached back into her binder, producing the official state death certificate, along with public registry screenshots confirming the notary license had been closed and inactive since 2021. No active notary, no legal notice. That makes the entire eviction order invalid under Section 48, subsection A of Mississippi housing law. Her voice never rose. She didn't dramatize the moment. She let the truth speak, cold and bare. Briggs froze, caught mid-reach for his pen, his confident smirk draining into something tight and uneasy. Even Judge Warren shifted in his seat, clearing his throat louder than necessary. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She turned the page in her binder and held up a second stack of documents, organized, labeled, bulletproof. "This is where the story begins to rot," she said. "Upon investigating the source of Miss Turner's rental payment records, I found significant inconsistencies between deposits received by the landlord and the business filings reported to the state." She approached the projector screen and, with the click of a remote, displayed a series of highlighted spreadsheets and tax forms. In the second quarter of last fiscal year, 3 full months of reported rental income disappeared from Turner Properties LLC's filings. She flipped to the next screen. But that same income reappears in a newly formed entity, Lark Hill Services LLC, registered in Delaware to avoid local transparency requirements, and owned by the same man, Daniel Green. She paused. "The plaintiff." One man in the gallery leaned forward, brow furrowed. Evelyn Turner clasped her hands to her mouth in disbelief. Briggs was now visibly sweating, his temple beating under the courtroom lights. He adjusted his tie. Searched for something, anything, in his notes, but he looked like a man reading instructions in a language he no longer understood. Jasmine stood completely still, eyes forward, voice calm. What this suggests is intentional obfuscation of income to evade taxes and conceal available funds, likely to fabricate a case for non-payment when no such deficiency existed. She let the accusation land without blinking. In short, the plaintiff manufactured a narrative, forged a notarization, and brought it before this court to illegally dispossess a woman of her home. It was no longer a courtroom, it was a powder keg. Judge Warren stared at the documents now spread before him like landmines. He looked cornered, like a man realizing too late that the floor beneath him had shifted. He tapped his gavel once, not to restore order, but because he didn't know what else to do. "Ms. Jasmine," he said, voice noticeably quieter, "you are accusing the plaintiff of perjury and financial fraud?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "I am not accusing, Your Honor," she replied. "The documents accuse. I'm merely giving them a voice." It was surgical, not loud, not theatrical, just undeniable. For the first time, Warren didn't speak. Briggs didn't move. The gallery didn't whisper. Everyone was frozen, not out of fear, but revelation. Jasmine had turned a courtroom that mocked her into a room that feared her. Judge Warren leaned back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable, his fingers tapping the gavel like it might offer him a way out. The room had shifted. The gallery, once noisy with doubt and low chuckles, now sat stiff and quiet. Jasmine's evidence had cut deeper than expected. The forged notary, the shell companies, the paper trail that led straight to the plaintiff's front door. And yet, as the power in the room began to tilt away from him, the judge did what he had always done when cornered. He reached for procedure. "This court," he said, his voice overly formal, "acknowledges that the evidence provided by Ms. Turner's representative presents potential discrepancies. However, given that no formal motion has been submitted to request evidentiary hearing and without a sworn deposition or cross-examination of the notary's records, the court is limited in what it may consider today." His words were fast, mechanical. He wasn't speaking to Jasmine. He was speaking to the wall behind her, hoping it might swallow his responsibility. "Accordingly, I will dismiss the eviction without prejudice and recommend that both parties seek appropriate civil recourse if desired. This hearing is now—" "Your Honor," Jasmine said, interrupting without raising her voice. "One last statement, for the record." The gavel froze midair. A second passed, then two. Warren's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not counsel of record. Your standing here is already exceptional. This court doesn't make a habit of giving the floor to—" "I won't take the court's time," Jasmine replied, her voice calm, unwavering. "But what I will say, what I must say, is not for me. It's for every person in this room who's ever been dismissed without being heard." Her tone didn't plead, it pressed. Warren studied her for a long moment, as if calculating the political risk of letting her speak one more sentence. Then, with the smallest nod, he lowered the gavel, but not in dismissal. The room held its breath. Jasmine stepped to the center of the courtroom. She didn't walk quickly. She didn't project theatrics. But there was something in the air around her that made people lean forward, as though they knew something was about to change, even if they didn't know what. She stopped, facing the judge directly, then slowly turned toward the gallery. "My name," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "is Jasmine Crockett." There was a pause. At first, the name meant little to some, but not to all. From the second row, a woman gasped and whispered, "That can't be." A man 3 rows behind her mouthed the name again, brows raised. Even Briggs, who had begun stacking his files with smug dismissal, looked up sharply. Jasmine let the silence build, not out of pride but precision. "For 15 years, she continued, her voice steady, "I have served as legal counsel for families crushed by systems that pretend to be blind, but somehow always seem to favor the powerful. I've advised legislative committees on housing rights reform. I've defended victims of redlining, gentrification, and predatory lending practices. I've stood before appellate judges and walked into federal buildings filled with men who didn't believe a black woman from the South could know more than they did. Now," she turned back to Warren, locking eyes, "but today I came here as a community representative. I didn't flash credentials. I didn't demand special treatment. I came dressed like the people I serve, and I stood in line like everyone else." She took a breath. "And what did this courtroom do? It laughed, it mocked, It tried to erase my voice before I ever opened my mouth. She wasn't angry. She was surgical. I let it happen, not because I didn't know how to stop it, but because I wanted everyone here to see exactly how easy it is to discredit someone who looks like me. How fast a woman defending her neighbor becomes a nuisance. How quickly truth becomes inconvenient when it threatens comfort. She took a step forward, not toward the bench, but toward the people. I'm not here to be a headline. I'm not here for applause. I came because Ms. Turner, like so many others, was being erased with paperwork, evicted not just from her home, but from the dignity of being heard. I came because this courtroom forgot something, that justice doesn't require wealth or a title or $1,000 retainer. It requires courage and truth. There was no movement in the room now. Even the court reporter had paused, forgetting to type. The law, Jasmine said, her voice calm but heavier now, is not the property of the privileged. It is the promise to the powerless. It belongs to the mother with 2 jobs and no lawyer, to the senior who doesn't know how to read fine print, to the family fighting a system that counts on their silence. She stopped. Let it hang. And then, I didn't come here for recognition. I came here to remind this courtroom, and every courtroom like it, that you don't need a badge to tell the truth, and you don't need permission to demand justice. Judge Warren sat motionless, his fingers frozen above his paperwork. His face was unreadable, but his posture had changed. His authority rattled. Briggs said nothing, eyes locked on Jasmine like a man watching a chessboard collapse. Evelyn Turner had tears in her eyes, not of fear but relief, vindication. She was no longer invisible, and around them all the room exhaled, not just in surprise but in shame, quiet, unspoken shame, because they had seen what power should look like, and it didn't wear a robe or a tailored suit. It wore courage. The silence after Jasmine's statement hung heavy, but she wasn't finished. Not yet. She stepped back toward the center of the room, her binder still tucked under her arm like a weapon, yet to be unsheathed. And if the court will allow, she continued, voice calm but cutting, I'd like to submit one final exhibit, something I discovered during my preparation for this case, though it extends well beyond Ms. Turner's eviction. She opened her binder slowly, methodically, then pulled out a thick folder sealed in a plastic sleeve. This, she said, handing it to the clerk, is a record of campaign contributions made to the judicial campaign of one Judge Malcolm Warren over the last 6 years. Specifically, contributions made by Turner Properties LLC, Larkhill Services LLC, and 6 other landlord-owned entities, all registered under a shared parent company. The gallery stirred. This wasn't just law anymore. This was corruption. Each entity donated just under the reporting threshold, Jasmine continued, which taken individually seems legal, but when viewed as a collective across shell corporations, it paints a very different picture. Judge Warren's face paled, his jaw tightening as if he'd bitten down on something sour. Jasmine turned slightly, eyes scanning the room. Now, what makes this more than coincidence, she said, pacing slowly, is that in the last 4 years alone, Judge Warren has presided over 36 eviction cases involving these same property groups. She held up a stack of printed court dockets. 36, and in every single case the ruling favored the landlord, without exception. Her tone wasn't loud, it was lethal. No delays granted, no continuances approved, not one case referred to mediation. She stepped closer to the bench, eyes locked on the judge. That's not law, Your Honor. That's a pattern. And patterns, especially those tied to campaign money, demand accountability. Briggs shifted uneasily in his seat, his face tight with panic, thinly veiled behind professionalism. She paused just long enough for the weight of her words to settle in like concrete. This isn't just about one forged eviction notice, she continued. This isn't just about Ms. Turner being targeted. Jasmine gestured to the gallery, to the people watching with wide, frozen eyes. This is about dozens of families who were pushed out of their homes, many without legal counsel, some without even being present, because the system wasn't built to hear them. It was built to move them. Her words sliced through the room like a scalpel. And the more we dig, the more this looks less like a courtroom and more like a machine, a well-oiled legal mechanism engineered to funnel power upward and silence those who resist. Judge Warren leaned back in his chair, but there was no hiding the sweat beading along his brow. The mask of authority was cracking, slowly, visibly. "This," Jasmine said, holding up the final folder, "is a preliminary report compiled from court archives, campaign finance records, and state business filings. I've sent copies to the state attorney's office, the Judicial Ethics Commission, and the Bar Association." A few audible gasps echoed across the gallery. "And now," she said, placing the folder on the clerk's table with deliberate finality, "this courtroom is on the record. Whatever happens next, this doesn't stay buried." The walls seemed to close in around Judge Warren. The once controlled atmosphere of the courtroom had unraveled into something raw, exposed, and electrified. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended a tenant, she detonated a legal conspiracy with a stack of papers and a calm voice. And the judge who once mocked her now sat at the center of a web the whole room could see. The room was on the edge of something, tilting, trembling, seconds from collapse. But Jasmine didn't let it fall quietly. She drew a breath, calm and controlled, then stepped forward again, voice unwavering. "Given the evidence presented here today, and the apparent conflict of interest now seated behind the bench," she said, eyes locking with Judge Warren's, "I am formally requesting that this case be transferred to the jurisdiction of the Mississippi Bureau of Judicial Conduct and the State Attorney General's office." The words weren't a plea, they were a trigger. This court cannot investigate itself, not when the judge overseeing the case is tied, financially and procedurally, to the same network responsible for the abuse. Warren opened his mouth to interrupt, but Jasmine didn't let him. "With all due respect, Your Honor, you are no longer in a position to rule on this matter. Not with credibility, not with integrity." Gasps rippled through the room. You could feel the tides shift in real time. "The plaintiff committed fraud," Jasmine continued. "But if this courtroom allows that fraud to go unpunished, if it buries this file, closes this case quietly, then it becomes a participant in the crime." She turned toward the clerk, placing a signed motion and full report on the table. "This is a written request for state-level review under Mississippi Code, Section 9-4-23. It outlines the connection between Turner Properties, LLC, the judge's campaign finance reports, and 36 prior cases of potential judicial bias." Her hands were steady, but her words hit like a hammer. "This isn't just an ethics violation, it's institutional misconduct, and I refuse to let it be treated like anything less." The gallery exploded, not in volume, but in energy. People leaned forward. They whispered names. They repeated numbers. A woman in the third row wiped tears from her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from something else. Vindication. Jasmine had done what no one thought possible. She had turned the courthouse upside down, and she wasn't done shaking. Judge Warren leaned forward slowly, like a man walking out onto thin ice. "Ms. Crockett," he said, his voice dry, cautious, "you are accusing a sitting judge of corruption in open court. That's a serious charge." "I'm not accusing," she replied, never blinking. "I'm submitting evidence. The charges are for someone else to decide." She turned toward the gallery now, speaking not just to the judge, but to every witness in the room. "Let the system be tested. Let the process work for once. Not against us. But that can only happen if it's moved out of this room and into the hands of those who don't have something to lose." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Everyone, Warren, Briggs, the clerk, the bailiff, felt it. Jasmine had taken control, not just of the narrative, not just of the courtroom, but of the very machinery they thought only they could touch. The first crack in the silence wasn't loud, but it was deep. A soft, wet gasp came from the back row, almost too quiet to notice. An older woman with short gray curls clutched a wrinkled tissue in one hand, her other hand gripping the armrest as if it anchored her to the room. Her lips trembled, but no words came, only tears, steady and unrelenting. For years, she had sat in that very courtroom as a spectator, watching others fall to rulings she didn't understand. She thought the law was simply a language she never learned. Now, for the first time, she realized it was a weapon aimed at people like her. She looked at Jasmine, and in her expression was something between gratitude and grief. Next to her, a young woman, maybe her daughter, rubbed her shoulder but stared straight ahead, frozen as if holding back a storm she had buried for too long. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't have to. The truth was doing the talking now. Then the dam broke. A man, mid-60s, wearing a work-stained flannel shirt and jeans, rose slowly from the third row. He wasn't loud. He didn't gesture wildly, but his voice carried like it had been waiting years to be heard. "I was evicted in this very room 10 years ago," he said, eyes fixed on Judge Warren. "Notice came in the mail, signed by a notary. Said I owed $300. He paused, swallowed. "But I paid it. I had the receipt in my hand when I showed up. Judge didn't even let me speak. Said it was already decided. Told me to leave." A hush fell again. His voice cracked. "I slept in my truck for 2 weeks. My wife left the year after." He didn't cry. He just stood there, fists clenched, broken in a way only time could explain. And then, one by one, they started standing. A woman 3 rows back. "They evicted my mother the day after her cancer surgery. No warning." A teenage boy holding his grandmother's hand. "They said she signed something, but she can't even read." A construction worker in steel-toed boots. "Same notary, same stamp." "My lease was still valid." A mother in scrubs. "I had proof of payment." They wouldn't even look at it. The air inside the courtroom changed. It became heavier, but not oppressive. It became alive, with voices, with memory, with rage. Jasmine stood tall in the center, eyes wide but not surprised. This was never just about Ms. Turner. It was never just about this one ruling. This courtroom was a crime scene dressed in tradition, and now the victims were lining up to speak. Judge Warren gripped the edges of the bench, watching as his courtroom turned against him. Not in chaos, but in clarity. His face lost all color. This was no longer a hearing. It was an exposure. Every nod, every tear, every whispered "me too" was a brick crashing through the walls he had built around his authority. People pulled out manila folders, folded letters, emails printed in blurry black and white. One man held up a yellowed eviction notice, shaking in his hand. "Same company," he said. "Same language. Same judge." A woman turned to the person beside her, whispering, "We thought we were just unlucky." Another said, "They told me I didn't have a case, but I never knew about the money, about the connections." The tension wasn't chaotic. It was unified. A low, rolling thunder of revelation passing from person to person, row to row, connecting lives that had once believed they suffered alone. For so long, this courtroom had been a place where voices were cut short, where silence was a requirement for survival. But not anymore. Jasmine stepped back, allowing the energy to build. Her eyes scanned the gallery. People who had walked in as strangers, but were now united by shared injustice. A collective truth had surfaced, and no one, not even a judge with decades on the bench, could bury it again. Judge Warren tried to speak. His mouth opened, but his voice failed him. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't drown beneath the wave rising inside the room. And in that moment, for the first time, he looked small, not just in stature, but in power, because now the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to them. It didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. The polished oak, the elevated bench, the weight of centuries of legal formality, it was all still there. But something beneath it had shifted. The air was thicker, still, not with fear but with gravity, with consequence. For once, the cold machinery of law had stalled, not to punish the powerless, but to face itself in the mirror. Judge Warren leaned forward, his voice no longer carrying authority, only obligation. "The eviction order is vacated, effective immediately." The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy, irrevocable. Evelyn Turner's shoulders dropped, as if something enormous had finally slid off her back. She blinked fast, her breath catching, her fingers trembling in her lap like leaves in wind. Jasmine placed a hand gently on her shoulder, solid, steady, anchoring her in the reality of this moment. A moment that had taken everything to reach. But the judge wasn't done. "In addition," he said, each word dragging behind the last like a weight chained to his conscience. This court formally refers all evidence submitted today, including documents detailing forged notarization, falsified financials, and irregular eviction rulings, to the Office of the Attorney General of the State of Mississippi. The gallery froze. No murmurs this time, no whispers, just a collective inhale as the courtroom grasped the full scale of what had just happened. A local judge had referred himself to the state for investigation. Furthermore, he added, clearing his throat, this matter is also being submitted to the Judicial Ethics Commission for immediate review. All eviction cases previously ruled on by this court involving Turner Properties LLC and its affiliates will be subject to reevaluation. It was an earthquake wrapped in legal language, and still, no one moved. Then Evelyn let out a sound, half laugh, half sob, that seemed to slice through the tension like sunlight through fog. Her hand covered her mouth. Her chest shook as tears streamed freely down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because she had won. She was crying because she hadn't been erased. Her home, her dignity, her right to simply exist without fear was finally recognized. She turned toward Jasmine with the kind of expression people only wear when they've seen justice for the first time in their life. Jasmine didn't say a word. She just nodded. Judge Warren spoke again, but now his voice was softer. Ms. Turner will remain in her home under full legal protection during the course of these investigations. All outstanding rent claims are hereby dismissed. He adjusted the papers in front of him, but his hands weren't as steady as they had been hours earlier. Given the undue stress and emotional damage caused by this fraudulent eviction process, this court also recommends mediation proceedings for restitution, the exact sum to be determined by a neutral arbitrator. This time the silence was a different kind of heavy, not with tension, but with release. In the back row, someone whispered, "It's really happening." Another voice, quiet and awed, added, "They're finally listening." People began nodding, not to one another, but to themselves, like they were remembering their own eviction letters, their own court dates, their own silencing. Jasmine turned slowly to face the room. Her eyes scanned the faces, not for approval, but for awareness. She had seen too many courtrooms, too many men like Briggs, too many benches like Warren's. She knew this victory wasn't the end, but it was a shift, a breach in the wall. Briggs sat hunched, lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. His knuckles were white, his pen unmoving. His entire posture was collapsed, not out of exhaustion, but defeat. He didn't even try to argue, didn't protest, didn't reach for one last technicality to hide behind, because there were none left. The law he had twisted for so long had finally turned back on him. As the final words settled, Judge Warren set down his pen, slowly, deliberately. The same hand that had signed dozens, perhaps hundreds of rushed eviction orders now hung useless at his side. His eyes met Jasmine's one last time. There was no defiance left, no superiority, only a quiet, exhausted resignation. And in that look, Jasmine saw what she had come for. Not revenge, not applause, but the crack, the undeniable fracture in the facade of invincibility this system had always worn. She had forced it to flinch. Evelyn stood up slowly, as if still testing whether her legs would carry her through this new reality. The clerk approached and handed her a signed order of dismissal. Her hands shook as she accepted it. She stared at it like it was more than a piece of paper, because it was. It was a return, a resurrection, a validation of all the days she thought the world had stopped seeing her. And then she did something no one expected. She reached into her worn purse, pulled out the crumpled eviction notice, the very one that had nearly cost her everything, and held it up. Then without a word, she tore it clean down the middle. The room didn't erupt. It didn't have to. This was not a moment for noise. It was a moment for truth. The courthouse behind them had fallen silent. No more objections. No more gavel strikes. No more men in suits playing gods with paper and signatures. Just sunlight stretching over cracked pavement and the hum of distant traffic moving on, unaware that history had just shifted inside that aging brick building. Jasmine walked quietly down the courthouse steps, her binder still tucked under one arm, her pace unhurried. The press swarmed in a half circle at the base of the stairs like bees around a fire. Flashes sparked. Microphones were shoved in her path. A woman with a network badge barked a question too fast to understand. "Ms. Crockett, how long have you known about the judge's connections?" Another voice rose behind it. "Will there be criminal charges?" One shouted over the others. "Do you plan to sue the court itself?" But Jasmine didn't stop. Her eyes never flinched, never darted toward the cameras. She walked straight through the chaos as if none of it touched her, like a ghost passing through noise. The reporters faltered. Their voices dropped. They watched her go, realizing too late that this wasn't a woman chasing spotlight. This was a woman who had already been in the dark and learned how to light her own fire. Evelyn followed behind her slowly, still holding the crumpled court papers that had once felt like a death sentence. She looked around at the reporters, then at the courthouse. For so long, she thought this place was final. That once you walked in, whatever it handed you, you just had to take. But today, she had walked out not just with her home, but with herself. They turned a corner, away from the cameras. The noise fell behind them. The late sun warmed the sidewalk in wide golden streaks. Jasmine stopped near the edge of a parking lot, the courthouse now just a shadow behind her. She took a deep breath, not heavy, not tired, just present, like someone finally standing in clean air after years of smoke. And that's when Evelyn spoke, voice soft but shaken. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you help me?" Jasmine didn't turn right away. She looked down the street first, where the sun was dipping behind rooftops and casting long, sharp silhouettes across the asphalt. Then she looked over her shoulder at Evelyn, her eyes calm but ancient in a way only experience can make them. "Because I've been where you are," she said plainly. The words weren't rehearsed. They came from a place too deep for performance. "I've felt the floor drop beneath my feet with no one there to catch me. I've watched my mother beg a landlord for one more week. I've seen men in courtrooms call her ma'am while quietly stealing everything she had left." Her voice tightened, but only slightly. "The law didn't care. The papers didn't care. And for years I thought maybe that was just how things were, that we were meant to lose." She paused, watching Evelyn absorb it. The older woman's eyes were brimming again. But it wasn't grief anymore. It was something closer to awakening. "But then," Jasmine continued, "I learned the law isn't magic. It's a tool, and it's been used against people like us for too long. So I decided I'd learn to wield it better than anyone. Not for trophies, not for claps, but because no one else was coming." Evelyn nodded slowly, a hand tightening on the strap of her purse. "And today," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "wasn't about saving you. It was about ending the lie that says people like you are alone." Jasmine turned back toward the horizon. The streets were empty. The world was quiet again. And in that golden, fleeting silence, Jasmine took one last breath and stepped forward. Not toward applause, not toward interviews, but toward the next unseen battle. She didn't need a parade. She didn't need anyone to remember her name, because she hadn't come to be remembered. She came to make sure someone else didn't get forgotten. And as her silhouette stretched into the fading light, Evelyn stood alone for a moment, watching the woman who had walked into her life like a storm and left like a prayer. The camera would fade to her retreating figure, backlit by the orange haze of sundown, each step disappearing into the glow. Then over that image, the narration would begin, not Jasmine's voice, but something older, wiser, like truth speaking to the audience directly. Some people don't need a headline, or a statue, or their face on a billboard. Some people carry justice in their bones, and all they need is a courtroom brave enough to listen. They don't come to be honored. They come to make sure someone else gets a fighting chance. And then quietly, they disappear, back into the fire, fade to black. It didn't take long for the story to ripple. By sunrise the next day, the courtroom that had stood for decades as an unshakable symbol of local power was the center of something else entirely. Scrutiny. The first report was a grainy clip posted online. 26 seconds of shaky cell phone footage showing Judge Warren's voice breaking as he vacated the eviction and ordered a full investigation. No production, no graphics, just raw silence interrupted only by gasps and murmurs. And still, it went viral. Within hours, regional news picked it up. They ran the clip on repeat, paired with captions that read, "Judge orders self-investigation after evidence of corruption uncovered," and "Community member uncovers illegal evictions in small Mississippi town." Jasmine's name wasn't even mentioned at first. No one knew it yet. The story wasn't about her. It was about the system she'd broken open with nothing more than a binder, a calm voice, and an unrelenting sense of justice. But by midday, people began asking, who was the woman in the blazer? The mystery became part of the magic. They found her name in the court transcript, Jasmine Crockett. No law firm listed, no business card handed out, no press conference, no camera smile, no social media. Just a name, spoken clearly once in front of a judge. A name that had unraveled decades of unchecked power. That evening, every local affiliate had some version of the story. In Pine Bluff, they led with it. Evelyn Turner appeared on screen, standing outside her home, the eviction notice in her hand now torn in half and tucked into a file labeled "Case Closed." Her voice was steady, eyes focused, no longer trembling. She spoke into the camera with the calm authority of someone who had already survived the worst thing she would ever face. "I thought I didn't matter," she said. "I thought the court was just another door that locked behind people like me." But that woman walked in and reminded everyone that justice doesn't have a dress code. It has a spine. The reporter asked her name. Evelyn smiled. "Jasmine," she said. "That's all I need to know." Elsewhere, threads began to unravel. Viewers watching from nearby towns started to recognize names. Turner Properties, Lark Hill Services, notaries, court clerks, judges. A woman in Greenville called into a radio show and said her mother had been evicted by the same property company after a mysterious rent discrepancy. A school teacher from Yazoo City posted online about how he'd lost his childhood home under a rushed ruling by Judge Warren 2 years prior. The more people spoke, the more the fragments came together, until what had once looked like isolated failures began to form a very clear shape. It wasn't random, it was routine. The state attorney general's office released a brief statement within 48 hours, confirming it had launched an inquiry into Turner Properties and the court rulings linked to Judge Warren. The Judicial Ethics Commission followed with a press release announcing that Warren's case history was under review and that he had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. For the first time in 27 years, his bench sat empty, and still, Jasmine was nowhere to be found. News vans returned to the courthouse, this time circling the building like sharks, hoping she might walk out again. Some camped outside the small legal aid clinic on the edge of town. Others visited the house where she'd once lived as a child, only to be told by neighbors that the family had moved long ago. She had left no footprint, no firm website, no book deal waiting in the wings. And as each reporter reached a dead end, a different story began to take root. That maybe Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to be found at all. Maybe she had only come to finish something. Still, her name echoed. People began whispering it in places where silence used to reign. In waiting rooms outside family court, in whispered conversations at grocery store checkouts, in whispered stories between tenants at apartment complexes who had once believed their evictions were isolated failures. Jasmine wasn't just a name. She had become a permission slip, a signal, a question people asked themselves when staring down the face of injustice. What would she have done here? Back in Pine Bluff, Evelyn Turner's life transformed, not with fanfare, but with quiet consequence. The sheriff's department officially removed the eviction order from her file. A county mediator contacted her to begin restitution negotiations. But the biggest change came when one evening she found two women waiting outside her door. Strangers. They carried folders, worn paper, familiar fear. "Someone told us what happened," one of them said, her voice nervous but filled with hope. "We were wondering if you might help us understand how you fought back." Evelyn looked at them for a long moment. Then she opened the door. She started small. She showed them how to read the fine print, how to demand a certified copy of the eviction order, how to search a notary's license status online. She even pulled out Jasmine's binder, the same one she had left behind with Evelyn the day she walked away. Inside were tab sections, printed statutes, sticky notes with hand-scribbled case names and cross-references. But it was the handwritten note taped inside the cover that Evelyn read most often. You don't need to be a lawyer to demand justice. You just need to refuse to disappear. In the weeks that followed, others came. A man from Greenville, a mother from Jackson, a college student from Memphis who drove 3 hours just to sit and take notes. They came with questions, with stories, with trembling hands, and left with tools. Evelyn wasn't Jasmine. She didn't want to be. But she had become something else, a keeper of the fire Jasmine lit. And Pine Bluff changed, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Tenants began requesting paper trails. Young people showed up at city council meetings. A group of high school students started a civic action club named Section 58 after the housing statute Jasmine cited in court. One of them, 16-year-old Andre Lewis, read every case Jasmine ever mentioned and stood in front of his school board to demand that eviction literacy be taught in their life skills class. All of it sparked by one woman who said almost nothing and did everything. They never found Jasmine. Some claimed to spot her once or twice, leaving a courthouse in Georgia, sitting alone at a coffee shop in Baton Rouge, helping a grandmother in New Orleans fill out a disability claim form. But those sightings were always fleeting, unconfirmed, like wind moving through cracks in a wall. And yet, her absence was louder than most people's presence. She didn't need to return. Her work had stayed behind, in homes that were no longer emptied by greed, in courtrooms that dared not rush their rulings, in the quiet moments when someone who had been stepped on too many times stood up and didn't apologize for doing so. And every now and then, someone would ask, "Where do you think she is now?" The answer always came the same way, a shrug, a smile, and a whisper, "Wherever she's needed next." Months had passed since the day Jasmine Crockett walked out of the courthouse and into the light, her name still echoing long after her footsteps disappeared. The story didn't fade. Instead, it spread like a slow, steady fire. Not the kind that raged and burned everything in its path, but the kind that stayed warm under the surface, waiting. Community boards that once held only notices for yard sales and church potlucks now carried hand-printed flyers. The messages were handwritten, some typed, others barely legible through fading ink and photocopy blur. But the message was clear: know your rights. Are you facing eviction? Have you ever been told you owed rent you already paid? Turner Properties, Lark Hill Services. If you recognize these names, you're not alone. No names were signed at the bottom, but they didn't need to be. Everyone knew who had lit the first match. In Pine Bluff, the town once dominated by silent fear, the energy shifted. Not all at once, but slowly, as neighbors began speaking to one another about things they had once whispered only to their ceiling in the dark. Evelyn Turner, once just another statistic in the system, now found herself opening her door every other day to someone new, a woman from 2 streets over who'd been told her rent check never cleared, a man who had been evicted last year and wanted to know if his notice had been legal, a teenager who didn't even understand what a lease agreement was, but wanted to learn so no one could trick my mom again. Evelyn had kept Jasmine's binder. At first it sat on her kitchen table like a relic. Then she began opening it every night, reading it, highlighting, making notes in the margins, just like Jasmine had. She created her own tabs, color-coded the statutes, learned what a motion to compel meant, what a bad faith eviction looked like. Then one evening she brought it to the local community center and placed it on the table in front of a dozen folding chairs. "Tonight," she said, voice clear and strong, "we talk about power and how we've been told we never had any." That was the first meeting. By the third, they had to move to the old library building. And it wasn't just Pine Bluff. All across the state, people were waking up, not because Jasmine told them to, but because her silence had dared them to speak. Jackson, Clarksdale, Greenville. Small towns that had always felt invisible were now connected by a network of people passing scanned documents, legal guides, and court transcripts from phones, printers, and gas station fax machines. They weren't lawyers. Most had never even been in a courtroom except as defendants. But they were learning. Fast. Some called themselves the 58s, after the housing code Jasmine had cited. Others simply used her initials, JC. At a church basement in Yazoo City, a group of teenage girls hosted a workshop on how to read your lease. They had pulled materials straight from Jasmine's binder, rewritten in simpler terms, with examples from their own neighborhoods. At a strip mall in Macomb, a group of retired veterans started a hotline where tenants could call to ask if their eviction looked suspicious. In Biloxi, a single mother printed 500 flyers and went door to door through her apartment complex, handing out printouts of notary license lookups. No one asked permission. No one waited for an invitation. That was Jasmine's greatest lesson. The system only worked against them when they waited for it to give them something. So they took it instead. Meanwhile, news continued to break. The investigation into Judge Warren revealed more than anyone expected. Sealed court records, missing audio recordings, and a pattern of disproportionate rulings favoring the same cluster of landlords. A state-level audit found that over 200 eviction cases had been handled in violation of procedural standards. 45 of those cases were reversed. Some tenants were compensated, others were still fighting. But this time, they weren't fighting alone. And Daniel Green, the landlord who had started it all, he was indicted on 6 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of falsifying legal documents, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud a state court. His empire crumbled quietly. The properties were sold, rebranded, but no new sign could hide what had happened. The people remembered. Jasmine never returned, not to Pine Bluff, not to the press, not to the courtroom she cracked wide open. She left no interviews, no victory tour, no social media posts with a raised fist and a hashtag. Her name became something different now. Not a brand, not a figurehead, a principle. One evening outside the community center, Evelyn sat across from a young woman who'd driven 2 hours to ask a simple question. "Why do you do this?" Evelyn smiled, her fingers brushing over the binder's worn edge. "Because someone did it for me when no one else would," she said. She didn't stay. She didn't want credit. But she made sure I had what I needed to stand up. Now it's my turn to pass that on. The woman asked her, what was her name? Evelyn smiled again, this time slower. Jasmine? Where is she now? Evelyn looked toward the horizon. I don't know, she said, but I bet someone else is asking that same question in some other town, about to lose their home, about to give up. And maybe, just maybe, Jasmine's walking in their direction. By the 6-month mark, Pine Bluff held its first ever tenant protection forum, attended by over 200 residents. Legal experts volunteered time. Law students drove in from Baton Rouge and Oxford. A retired judge from Tennessee offered to help vet questionable evictions for free. No one was paid. No one asked for thanks. And at the center of every conversation, every clipboard, every form passed around. Jasmine's name was never printed, but everyone spoke like she was still in the room. A mural appeared on the side of the old courthouse weeks later. It showed a woman in profile, face turned slightly, blazer flapping in the wind, her hand holding a binder, her body walking forward into gold. It didn't have her name, just words in bold paint beneath her feet. She didn't ask for power. She took it back, and from there, passed it on. Because some people change laws, others change people. And when the system forgets who it's meant to serve, sometimes it only takes one person to walk in, quietly, and remind it. But when the movement spread and the system finally started shaking, a deeper truth emerged, one that wasn't written in any legal file, printed on a court docket, or chanted in protest. It was written in the eyes of every person Jasmine had fought for, the single mother with eviction papers in her purse, the retired veteran who never understood why his hearing lasted only 90 seconds, the teen who watched his family be pushed out of their apartment because of a technicality they couldn't pronounce. These people weren't just victims, they were targeted, not because of what they had done, but because of what they lacked. Time, money, paperwork, power. In every cracked sidewalk, in every courthouse bench, in every ink-smudged document, a quiet war was being fought, one that no one televised, until Jasmine stepped into it and reminded everyone that justice is only blind when those in power choose to look away. The real injustice wasn't just in the forged signatures or the corrupt judge. It was in how easy it had become to normalize losing. The system didn't shout, "You don't matter." It whispered it in every unanswered phone call, every denied appeal, every gavel dropped without even asking the defendant to stand. That was the design. And Jasmine knew it, because she had been on the receiving end of that silence. And once you survive it, you can never forget its sound. So she came back, not to shout, not to storm the building, but to expose it one layer at a time, with evidence, with clarity, with unshakable truth. And through her fight, the real lesson came into view. It wasn't that heroes wear suits or stand behind podiums. It wasn't that justice always wins if you try hard enough. It was that the line between dignity and destruction is paper thin. And for the most vulnerable, it takes only a missed envelope or a skipped form to fall straight through the cracks. Evelyn Turner didn't face a villain with a gun. She faced a printed letter, a smile from a landlord, a stamp on a form. And that's what made it more terrifying, because that's how oppression works in modern times. Quiet, lawful, disguised as order. But Jasmine showed the world that the most dangerous weapon in a corrupt system is someone who knows the rules better than the people abusing them. Her journey wasn't about revenge or reputation. It was about interruption, interrupting the cycle where the poor are too tired to fight, where the truth is too buried to matter, where courtrooms become machines instead of arbiters of fairness. She didn't wait for the law to come save Evelyn. She became the law's reminder of why it exists in the first place. And in doing so, she forced everyone watching, judge, attorney, clerk, neighbor, to ask themselves a question they hadn't faced in years. What if the person we're ignoring is right? The human lesson in Jasmine's story is brutal in its honesty. That justice is not self-correcting. It takes effort. It takes resistance. It takes someone willing to be uncomfortable, unwelcome, and unwavering. Jasmine could have walked away. She could have sent an email, written a letter, filed a quiet complaint. But she walked in herself, binder in hand, truth in her mouth, and history behind her, because she knew that nothing changes unless someone makes it personal. And the story she left behind wasn't just about saving Evelyn's home. It was about reminding people they're not crazy for feeling like the system is rigged. They're not weak for struggling to survive it. And they're not alone if they've ever looked around and thought, this can't be justice. The binder Jasmine carried became more than a tool. It became a torch, a symbol that knowledge, when weaponized in the right hands, can be more dangerous to corruption than any protest ever could be. And the people she empowered didn't just learn the law. They learned to see themselves as worthy of it. That's the part no one talks about. How much strength it takes to believe you deserve protection when everything in your world has taught you to expect punishment. In every great fight for justice, there comes a moment when someone stops asking for help and starts demanding fairness. That's what Jasmine taught. She didn't give Evelyn a miracle. She gave her a megaphone. She didn't overthrow a courtroom. She restored its purpose. And in doing so, she left behind a blueprint, not for rebellion, but for reckoning. For every mother, veteran, student, worker, tenant, citizen who's ever been told they were too late, too poor, too invisible. Jasmine's message was simple. You don't need permission to be right. You just need to be ready when they finally listen. And even though she vanished before the cameras came, her legacy remained. Not in headlines, but in habits. In people who now question their lease terms. In judges who now double-check their own rulings. In clerks who stop and ask, has this person been heard? That's the lesson. That true justice isn't about one dramatic victory. It's about shifting the balance back where it belongs, piece by piece, voice by voice. And the most powerful force in that fight is a person who remembers what it feels like to be forgotten and swears they'll never let it happen again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.